What's going on, guys? Welcome back to another episode of the Next Man Up podcast. I'm your host, Bannon Crowley. I'm here with my co-host, Colin Martin. How are we doing?
We're doing great. It's been a little while, but happy to be back. Love hopping on the podcast, and there's a lot of stuff for us to talk about. So I think we should get straight into it.
Yeah, and like you said, we haven't been on here in a little while, but we're back now. So that means that there is some stuff that we missed. There are a few things that I want to go over in the NFL first. Let's just start off. We've seen a lot of teams recently, and a lot of these answers may have changed recently too, especially today with some injuries coming out. But let's start off with the AFC. We're going to go through pretender or contender. And the definition, I think, for these is a team that could actually contend. A lot of these teams on the list could easily, I think most of these teams could make the playoffs, but I'm saying, AFC championship slash Super Bowl at this point, not just make the playoffs and get killed in the first round. Starting off a team that's kind of on the edge, though, it's been on a lot of people's minds, the Bills. How do you think the Bills will fare this season? They haven't been good in the past few weeks. Josh Allen now is starting to turn into Daniel Jones, not in a good way.
Yeah, I mean, with all that being said, a lot of people are talking about Buffalo right now, and I hate to say it, but I have to say they're a pretender. I mean, they're 5-5 with one of the toughest strength of schedule left, and it kind of feels like the Dolphins have a chokehold on that AFC East. We'll talk about them in a little bit, but they just look like the better team, and that's not something we've said in the last couple of years with Buffalo. I mean, contenders don't fire their offensive coordinator at midseason. There's a reason for that. And I just don't think that they're going to be a team that's fighting for, as you mentioned, AFC Championship or Super Bowl. They're a team I still think can make the playoffs. They have a tough path to get there, but I don't think they're a Super Bowl level team.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with you. This is a team that the past few years I've never been bought in on the Bills just because I didn't really think Josh Allen had that top end talent, especially compared to these other teams in the AFC with Patrick Mahomes and the Joe Burrow and the Bengals these past few years. Now you throw in all these other teams. I don't think they're a contender, but like you alluded to, another team in this division, the Dolphins. I know you've been very high on them. Throughout the past few weeks, we've seen a lot of things happen with this team. Do you still think that they're a contender?
Yeah, Banning, I'm still pretty hot on them. I do think the Dolphins are a contender in the AFC, and it goes past Mike McDaniel's coaching, which is incredible, as I allude to a lot. But they also have a pretty easy schedule, kind of the opposite of the Bills. And Devon Achane, the guy that has proven to be their X factor this season, looks like he could be back as soon as this upcoming week, and that's going to bolster their offense. Whether Mostert is the lead back doesn't really matter to me because you have the dynamics of Achane back there, and that's just an incredible thing. A lot of teams are jealous of that backfield. I just don't see them struggling in the division. I mean, it seems like they have the Bills number, but when you talk about the Patriots and the Jets, I mean, their seasons are pretty much all but over at this point, and I don't see Miami dropping, more than a game or two to those guys. So with that being said, I think the Dolphins get a nice road to the playoffs, and once they get there, there's a lot of teams, especially in the AFC North, which we'll talk about in a little bit, that are kind of, hanging on by a thread or, not really great playoff teams if they make it. I think a team like Miami goes in and dominates anyone like that. And their really only tall task is going to be against the Chiefs. Obviously, just played them last week. Things didn't go their way, but the fact that they compete with a team like Kansas City makes me pretty confident that they're a real contender in the AFC.
Yeah, and I know this may be a hot take. I'm going to go with the opposite side. I
Yeah,
know you brought up saying they have the Bills number. They did lose by almost 30 to the Bills earlier in
I
this
know.
season. So there's still something there. And when I look at this schedule, this team has been good. But when you look at the losses, they lost to the Bills, they lost to the Eagles, they lost to the Chiefs. And I mean, looking at those teams, these could be the potential teams that they would face in the playoffs. They can't win these big games. And it's really good when you can go out and beat teams like the Panthers, go beat the Giants by a good amount, go beat the Patriots twice. But in the end, if we really look at the teams that they've beat, I don't really see too many impressive wins. They beat the Chargers at the beginning of the year, but outside of that, they've just lost all the big games. So it's very hard for me to say that they're a true contender at this point when they can't beat the teams that they would be contending against.
Yeah, I think it's a fair take there. I think that's going to be a point that comes up a little bit later with a team over in the NFC. But I do think the Dolphins are just the better football team. especially when you compare him to the Bills. I know head to head is really tough in the NFL. They'll catch him again, so we'll see if I'm on the right side or not. But I do think the Dolphins' offense moves a little bit better. Feels like I always talk about their run defense. It's on the incline. Still not great towards the middle of the pack. I just think they do a lot of things really well. And although, yes, they beat easy competition, they've done what they've had to do. And you can't say the same for a team like Buffalo necessarily. So with the Dolphins, they do have a lot to prove, but they are a team that I think does go out and prove that. So a little bit of projection there, but I think they're closer to that top tier with a team like Kansas City than the middle of the pack with teams that, we'll be bringing up in a little bit.
Yeah, I would say personally, I have them just a tier below those kind of top end teams. But now going into basically a whole division, one we've been talking about this whole year, we will talk about the AFC North. Outside of the Ravens, I think we could both agree they are easily a top tier team as of this season. But let's just start off. We can go through, we'll kind of group these two teams together, the Browns and the Steelers. Both of these teams with some quarterback controversy, you could say some offensive coordinator issues. Obviously, the Browns today lost Deshaun Watson for what seems like the season at this point. They were doing very good with him. He was 5-1 as a starter this year. Whether that's due to his play or the rest of the team, that's definitely up for debate. But when he was in there, they were winning games. But for now, it seems like without him, it's going to be very tough. My question for you, between these two teams, I'm assuming you think at least one of them's a pretender. So which one do you have more faith in between these two teams?
Yeah, Banning, I'll tell you, I think they're both pretenders. I do not think either of these teams compete. But what I will say is I do have a little bit more faith in the Steelers. And I know I've been hating on the Browns for a while, but I don't think either of these teams are great. But when you look at what makes these teams solid and both of these teams contending out in the AFC North, they both have great defenses and pretty good coaching. I just prefer the Steelers coaching. In a lot of aspects, I prefer the Steelers defense. I know that's crazy to say. We'll talk about some awards later in this episode. And I like Myles Garrett more than a guy like TJ Watt, but I think the Steelers defense has some redeeming qualities across that middle linebacking core and on the edge rush opposite of TJ Watt. But outside of that, Mike Tomlin is making this horrible team go 6-3. And when they still have their quarterback in place, I'm not a huge Kenny Pickett believer. It makes me feel a little bit more confident. We talk about a team like the Browns, and we see with the 49ers, they're a step away from the Super Bowl because they don't have a quarterback. But outside of that, they have one of the most elite rosters across the entire NFL. The Browns just don't have that luxury. Great defense, but Nick Chubb is going to be gone. I mean, he's alluding that he might come back. I don't think that's going to happen. That injury was gruesome. And they don't have the receiving core that matches up with a team like the 49ers. I understand the Steelers don't have the offense, but I've just seen so much more from a coaching staff that makes me think, okay, maybe this team could actually make a run. I mean, we do see it every year. They're a team that kind of slugs through the regular season, but then you look back and you're like, oh my God, they're winning some games and they go into the playoffs, usually get beat, but they look like they can catch a game. I don't expect the Browns to necessarily make a run in the playoffs. And if we're being honest, I think one of these teams will miss the playoffs. I don't think they both get in. And I think that team would be Cleveland that misses it.
Yeah, and I think with Deshaun Watson, a very different team to this point. I think the Steelers' offense is built a little bit better. There's some better receivers over there. The Browns do have some solid ones, but obviously the injury to Nick Chubb hurts them too. And within this division, it's going to be tough right now. Both of those teams at 6-3. It seems like the Browns, though, without their quarterback throughout some of these games, Deshaun Watson being hurt for some of them so far, they've been able to keep it competitive and they've had a lot of different guys going in. I do think the Steelers have a better chance, but like you said, if they get to the playoffs, I don't really see the Steelers competing with any of these teams. Kenny Pickett kind of reminds me of a guy like Joe Flacco, where he could play very well throughout his career and maybe have some really good years where he can get far. Obviously, Joe Flacco won the Super Bowl. I think Kenny Pickett, I'm not going to project that he wins the Super Bowl, but I think he's one of those guys that could really shine throughout his career, but just not be consistent enough to be a top tier quarterback. Obviously, everyone talking about Joe Flacco throughout his career. Is he elite or not was always the question. Kenny Pickett shows flashes that he could be, but I don't think he's consistent enough to be. And another team in this division, too, the one in last place right now, the Bengals. I personally think these guys are contenders. If I was to put my ring in for any of these teams right now, besides the Ravens, even though the Bengals are in last place, with the way the Steelers and Browns look, I would give my playoff spot to the Bengals. I think they'll be able to figure it out.
Yeah, and I think we're in a similar place there. I like the Ravens a whole lot. That would be my pick, but I would go to the Bengals next. And it's kind of crazy that this is my argument when I talk about a team like the Bengals that was historically so bad in the last, 7, 8 years. But now they have experience. They have a lot of guys that were on that team that made the Super Bowl. And with Joe Burrow, it's a little bit tough because I know that game against Houston, he didn't look like himself. And the start of the season, he looked horrible, to be honest. But in between that stretch, we finally saw the flashes of elite Joe Burrow that we've been seeing the whole rest of his career, right? I mean, he looked really, really good the last couple weeks until Houston. And I keep bringing up that Texans game, but that makes it really tough because they're going to go take on Baltimore this week. And if I can be honest, that's going to be make or break for the Bengals season. I mean, they have to go out and win that game to show that they're still the best team in the AFC North because they don't look like it right now. And it would be kind of ridiculous to say that, but if they get the head on head matchup, they go out and get a win on prime time, then that can really snowball things into a late season, like really solid finish. They're going to have to step up. The defense has been bad all year, especially the run defense. I mean, they let guys go all over them. So I would imagine Baltimore would be the favorite there, considering Lamar Jackson's excellence and Gus Edwards having a really under the radar good season. So it's going to be a tough game for them, to be honest. And a guy like Joe Burrow is going to need to step up, lead them to a win. But I'm going to say contenders. I think they have the ability to do just that. But it's really tough with how good the Ravens have been looking.
Yeah, and the final team in the AFC that I want to talk about is the Texans. With 8 games left, this team is 5-4. I'll come out first. I do think these guys are contenders, which is kind of funny to say. Looking at this team at the beginning of the season, I didn't expect much. But through these last 8 games, you have the Cardinals, Jaguars, Broncos, Jets, Titans twice, Browns, and Colts. They've already beat the Jaguars this season. That should be a good game. Outside of that, I really don't see any threats. The Browns, without their quarterback or running back, they should be able to win that game. The Jets, that should be before Aaron Rodgers comes back. And the Titans twice, they should be able to beat them. They should be able to beat the Broncos and the Cardinals. I know the Broncos have come back a little bit, but this team with 5 wins right now out of those 8 games, I expect this team to win 10 games with the way that this team has been playing.
Yeah, and that's definitely a hot take. And I have to kind of give my hot take of my own because I do think they could get 10 wins. I don't think that it's ridiculous to say that, but I still think they're pretenders. Even if, I mean, the way we described it, a team that can make an AFC championship run, a team that can make a Super Bowl run, the Texans just aren't that. They have an easy strength of schedule. Don't get me wrong. I think they go into the playoffs with some energy. I mean, that could be something that we see. I mean, we saw it with a team like Cincinnati a couple of years ago. They go in with heat and they come out firing. That would be great, but I don't think Houston has that yet. CJ Stroud, we might bring him up later, but he is an elite quarterback. We all know that. The media has jumped all over it recently, but all season he's been one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. That's obviously something you want on a playoff team, but they just don't have elite offensive playmakers or a defense to make a real run yet. A playoff run would be amazing because it's much higher than we expected them to be. I just don't think they are a Super Bowl level team. I mean, if they spend this offseason addressing that secondary, maybe they draft their running back of the future to overtake Devin Singletary. In 2025, this could be a legit Super Bowl contender. Don't get me wrong. I just think they're one more offseason away. It's great to see them compete. I don't think that competition is going to lead them to an AFC championship or Super Bowl run, though.
I mean, on the opposite end, I think this team, depending on how we see them play in the playoffs, we've seen CJ Stroud play in big games. Last year in the playoffs, going against Georgia, he had 350 yards and 4 touchdowns in that game. And I don't think you could chalk up that loss to him with the kicker missing the field goal, but he went out there and played fantastic. So it's not like when he gets to the playoffs, he's going to be one of those guys that hasn't been in the moment. So I do give them the edge there. I do think with a lot of these teams in the AFC kind of all being around the same area, talking about these teams. When we look at the high end teams in the AFC, we look at the Chiefs, we look at the Ravens. We could say the Dolphins too. Maybe the Jaguars would be up there in that tier, but it really seems like there's only a few teams up there. The Texans have beat the Jaguars. We'll see how they play against them again. But if they go up against them with the current standings right now and they come out and they beat them next week, they would be first place in the division with the ability to control their own destiny. So they could have a very high seed with 10 wins. I do think this team is a contender personally right now. Let's go to the NFC though. Starting off, we'll start with America's team, the Cowboys. I think you guys could go guess where my answer is, but I'll let you start off with this one.
Yeah, I wanted to be original. I wanted to provide some of the opposite side, but I do think they're a pretender. And I want to gloss over a lot of the reasons why you were anti Dolphins earlier, because I think we're going to say a lot of the same things for Dallas here. I mean, they beat up on horrible competition. I mean, they lose to the Cardinals, but outside of that, they beat up on horrible competition and they're calling themselves contenders. But we saw it. They cannot beat the best teams in the NFC. I mean, they disappointed against Philly, they disappointed greatly against San Francisco. And to be a contender, we both know you got to beat the best to be the best. And they're simply just not doing that right now. I will say, I'm not a big Dak guy, but Dak is playing great. You look at his stats, he is playing like one of the better quarterbacks in the NFL, which is promising. And for Cowboys fans, I would get excited about that because this was a make or break season for him. But will he be able to do it in the playoffs? We haven't seen it before. I'm not going to go into this year thinking we're going to get something different when the team is telling the exact same story. And something I want to bring up is that Tony Pollard is not getting the looks we expect him to. When this Cowboys team was really competitive and a team I considered, one of the better teams in the NFC, that's when Ezekiel Elliott was having incredible season after incredible season. And I think the team is too one-dimensional right now for that to be the case. I want Tony Pollard to get involved. He's a great player, but with the way the offense is looking, I think that's going to be something that's going to be easy to shut down, especially if they match up with their big brother, the 49ers, once again. They know how to stop Dallas. And when you have a team like that that's competitive out in the NFC that has your number over and over again, I have to say you're a pretender.
Yeah, and I agree. Tony Pollard has barely seen the end zone this year. They just haven't really dialed much up for him. Dak Prescott has been playing very good. CD Lamb, a big reason why he's been playing like a top five receiver, almost 150 yards every week, it seems like. And this team is good, but they're falling into that trap that we see every year where they haven't been able to beat the big teams. They went out, they played very well against Philly, only that 5 point loss. You can look through to watching that game, one of the best games of the year, too, in my opinion. That was a good one. And then they beat the Giants by 40 both times. Do you really look at that game and see much? Dak Prescott played well against a bad defense. They go out, they play a team like the Patriots, they beat them by 35. The same exact story against the Giants. They lose to the Cardinals early in the season. I think that one's pretty much been washed away at this point. Losing to the 49ers by 32. We'll talk about the 49ers a little bit later. That was when the 49ers were kind of their full strength. Now very different, but I don't really think the Cowboys can compete in the NFC. The only reason why I think you could easily make an argument is the NFC is very weak right now. Outside of the Eagles, there are a lot of teams that you could point at. Maybe the Lions at 7-2, but obviously at the end of the day, they still have Jared Goff as their quarterback, so he can still be good. But if I look at the NFC, I really see the Eagles and then everyone else, and that's the only reason why I think you could argue that the Cowboys are competitive. But I do think that they're pretenders at this point. I don't really see them getting that far in the playoffs. Another team, though, we just talked about it. We can talk about the 49ers right now. Starting off, I mean, this team has not played great the past few weeks. What we've been talking about them the past month, they went out, they beat the Cowboys by 32. Then they lose to the Browns. They lose to the Vikings. They lose to the Bengals. They did just beat the Jaguars by 31. So maybe a bounce back, but what we've talked about with Brock Purdy, it hasn't looked very good the past few weeks. And it seems like without his playmakers, he is not a very good quarterback.
Yeah, and if the conversation was if he's a good quarterback or not, I'd probably be on the anti side. But I've said it before, I'll say it again. I really do think the 49ers are contenders in the NFC. And I think you bring up a great point there. They really only have to compete with the Eagles. I know that's very tough. The Eagles are good. There's a reason we're not even talking about them. We know they're contenders. So that's going to be a tough matchup. But if we get towards the end of the season and assuming this 49ers team is at full strength, they're good enough to have pretty much anybody at the quarterback helm. Last year in the playoffs, I know they disappointed, but let's not forget Brock Purdy went out with injury. And I like Josh Johnson as much as the next guy, but that's almost too steep of a hill to climb, if you know what I'm talking about here. I mean, just not a good scenario for them. And this year, that losing streak could have sunk their season going up against a team like Jacksonville. I mean, that's one of the best teams they're going to play all year. And they go out and win by a very large margin. And that makes me think that they fell down and they're ready to bounce back up. The addition of Chase Young, he's not going to be their star player or anything, but it shows that they still want to compete. They weren't going to chalk this season up as a disappointment halfway through, right? They wanted to get more playmakers on that defense. And really, he didn't necessarily have the biggest impact ever, but he looked good in some snaps out there, looked like a good addition. And that makes me promised of what this team has going forward. I mean, when you have a roster that consists of a guy like Christian McCaffrey, who's one of the top 10 players in football, a guy like Debo Samuel, who is having a really good year when he's on the field, an elite offensive line, and a really good defense, that makes me feel comfortable that Brock Purdy, as a top 20 quarterback in the NFL, can figure things out. I know it's not super promising necessarily. They might not be my NFC favorites right now, like they were at the start of the season, but I absolutely do think they're a contender. I think they're one of the handful of teams that can beat the Eagles right now.
Yeah, another team that has been good the past few weeks that we can talk about is the Vikings, bouncing back after a bad start to the season. They have been on fire with 5 wins in a row at this point. Going out after this weekend, Joshua Dobbs has come in and played well for this team. Justin Jefferson coming back too. This team, do you think they're a contender, or do you think they kind of fall into that same category of they've been on a hot streak, but when we see them play against good teams, it may not go well?
Yeah, and I hate this because I love Josh Dobbs. He's a Tennessee legend. I'm happy to see him come in and find early success, but they're still a pretender. And it's the same reasons why earlier this year they were one of the worst teams in the league. They just do not have the defense. I will say their defense has stepped up from that early season form. They're not the worst in the NFL, but they're still right around there when it comes to third down defense and red zone defense. And when we get time where we're in these very close games down the stretch, or if they do make the playoffs, and they get into a tight game and they can't play defense on third down or when the team is in scoring position, that's the end of the season. And I love Josh Dobbs, but we're not going to pretend like he's a top 10 quarterback in the league, although we've seen flashes of it, which is ridiculous. So I don't really see too much promise on the offensive side. I will say, though, when you have guys like Jefferson, who's going to come back hopefully fully healthy, and a guy like TJ Hawkinson, who's one of the best tight ends in football, it elevates a quarterback's play, right? It's going to make Dobbs' job pretty easy out there. I just don't think the Vikings have enough talent, to be honest with you. It is a little bit odd. They're in a tough spot, obviously, with Kirk being out for the year, Dobbs playing well. What do you do after this? But I don't think this is a season where you worry about making the Super Bowl. I think there's too many things ahead of you that you got to figure out first.
I agree with the Vikings there. And another team kind of in this same area that I want to talk about is the Seahawks, who are 6-3 right now. If we look through some of their wins, not really too impressed. They did beat the Lions, who are good this year. But as we look at it, coming up, they're going to have the Rams. After that, they're going to have San Fran, Dallas, San Fran, and Philly 4 weeks in a row. So I do think we're going to see how this team really looks. But as of right now, I do think that they've definitely benefited from an easy schedule. I don't think they're contenders.
Yeah, I'm in a tough spot with that. I'm happy to hear your take on that because it makes me feel a little bit better about mine because I'm very 50-50. I think at their best, the Seahawks team is absolutely contender. It's just the most inconsistent team in football. At their worst, the Ravens are running all over them, and that is a problem. They grabbed Leonard Williams at the trade deadline. He has to step up and be a better run defender at the defensive tackle position. Obviously, he is pretty good as a pass rusher in that spot, but they just need more from there. But I mean, in his elite moments, Geno Smith still looks like one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, but we even saw in that win against Washington that there's moments where he looks quite horrible. It's a very weird situation in Seattle, and with the tough schedule ahead of them, I'm going to say pretender just because it's going to be really hard, but I mean, we've seen Seattle battle with the best of them. That Lions game, they looked really, really elite, so it's going to be tough there, but I would say I'm 50-50 on them. I'm not going to give a take on that.
Yeah, I think once we see that 4 game stretch, then we'll definitely kind of get a big picture for them for the rest of the season. But we are at the midpoint of the NFL season now, just a week past it. So, with that being said, we're going to start with our midseason awards, and we can start off with the Defensive Player of the Year. Starting off at this point, it's been a little tough. Like I've said, I think pretty much everyone agree that the defensive line slash edge linebacker, whatever you want to put this into, those are the best players in the NFL at this point. When we look at guys like Nick Bosa, when we look at guys like Myles Garrett, TJ Watt, the edge position is the best that it's been in the NFL in a long time. And with that being said, it's kind of hard to pick someone, but as of right now, I think it is Myles Garrett in my opinion, but it is very close. I think you could easily make an argument for Micah Parsons or TJ Watt, but personally, I just think Myles Garrett, the stats and the way that he's been playing too, it is hard not to give it to him.
Yeah, it's really, really, really close between Myles Garrett and Micah Parsons for me. But one of them has, more turnovers forced, One of them leads the league right now in sacks, and that is Myles Garrett. So I'm going to roll with him as well. I do think if Micah Parsons continues his really strong campaign, I think he's right there with him. I do think it's a two-man race at this point, but I would also give the nod to Myles Garrett in that spot.
Yeah. And next up, just to go to the opposite side of the ball, the offensive player of the year. I think this one a little bit easier than the defensive player. Tyreek Hill has been fantastic this year. I do think that if we're looking right now, CeeDee Lamb is making some big games the past few weeks, but Tyreek Hill has been fantastic all season. I would be very shocked if he doesn't end up taking this trophy home.
Yeah, and I had a feeling we were going this way, but when I really looked at it, I do want to give Christian McCaffrey some credit. I would not be surprised if it's Tyreek Hill at all. Don't get me wrong, but CMC already has over 100 all-purpose yards. He's got 13 touchdowns to this point, and he's the one that keeps this 49ers offense afloat. We mentioned it, so I don't expect him to stop getting the ball anytime soon. Obviously, last week didn't get a touchdown. It was his first time not getting a touchdown in a long, long time, but he's just dominated, showed his excellence over and over again, and I do think it's a lot harder to game plan for a guy like Christian McCaffrey than Tyreek Hill. I don't necessarily think that makes him better, but obviously McCaffrey is elite in the receiving and the rushing game. So got to give him some credit there. Again, Tyreek Hill is a great contender. I think he is the favorite right now, but I'll put my vote in for Christian McCaffrey. I think he ends the season really strong.
Next up, starting with some rookies, we'll go to the defensive rookie of the year. Right now, I think it is Jalen Carter. Devon Witherspoon has played great, but Jalen Carter has played like the best player in that draft class. And it's still crazy that the Eagles got him with the 9th overall pick. He has had one of the highest PFF grades all year at his position and one of the best defenders in the NFL right now.
Yeah, absolutely. He's one of the best pass rushers in football at any position. The fact that he's doing it at D tackle is ridiculous. I love Devon Witherspoon. I really wanted to give him the nod there. I think he's had a very incredible season. And for the mainstream media is underrating him. He's one of the better corners in football as a rookie. But as you mentioned, Jalen Carter just playing incredible, playing like arguably the best player in this class, if not who I assume we're going to pick for the offensive rookie of the year. So going to give it to Jalen Carter here as well. I don't see him slowing down anytime soon.
Yeah, and like you said, offensive rookie of the year. I think it is CJ Stroud. I don't think there's any way he doesn't win this award. I think honestly, it may be a hot take, but even if he got hurt right now and didn't play for the rest of the year, he would still be up there. He has run away with this award. There has been some other great guys too. Puka has been great, a guy that kind of came out of nowhere this year. Jahmyr Gibbs has been good. He just hasn't really got as many looks with David Montgomery playing very well. Another guy out there too, Zay Flowers, who has been fantastic this year. It just seems like he started off hot and they haven't given him as many looks. Bijan Robinson too within this conversation, but another guy that just hasn't got some looks too. He's been a healthy scratch for some games, which is interesting, but CJ Stroud is the guy.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And there's talk about him being in the MVP race, and honestly, that is not the case for any other offensive rookie this year or defensive rookie for that matter. It's got to be CJ Stroud. He's one of the best quarterbacks in football right now, which is much better than we expected. Obviously, we liked him, but we weren't as high on him as we should be at this point. So he looks great. I love Jahmyr. I love Puka. You mentioned them both. I think they're in the contention for this race if something goes horribly wrong with CJ Stroud, but I don't see that happening. I think he's easily the biggest lock out of anyone we're talking about here.
Yeah, and next step before we get to the MVP, bouncing over to the coach of the year, I think there definitely is a few options right now within the NFL. There's a lot of good teams that have been playing well, and obviously you can chalk that up to coaching for a lot of these teams. And my pick right now, kind of looking towards the end of the season, would be DeMarco Ryans for the Texans. He has been great, and I do think with CJ Stroud playing very well, I do think that this team will, like I said before, probably win around 10 games. But I do think there is another guy that you could give it to. I'll see if you bring him up.
Yeah, and my original thought here was Mike Tomlin, especially with how the Steelers have been playing. But I will say Dan Campbell. I do think it's about time. This Lions team is really, really good. And I hate to reflect a little bit of media bias here, but he's a fan favorite. He's been incredible. I know you might be waiting on Mike McDaniel here or Kyle Shanahan. Those are both great options. But I do think Dan Campbell has this Lions team playing an elite level of football. They were obviously one of the worst teams in the league for a couple seasons just recently. And now they are, with a weak NFC, considered a pretty solid contender. So I think Dan Campbell is much deserving of the award.
Yeah, and I was thinking that was the guy that we could go with there. For the MVP, I think this one is the closest out of most of the awards right now. I still am going to go with my pick with Patrick Mahomes right now. I do think you could easily go with a guy like Jalen Hurts for the Eagles. But I just think Patrick Mahomes, he's had some bad games, but there hasn't really been anyone that we would usually see at this moment where we could say he's a clear front runner for the MVP, just because there's been a lot of teams that have been good, but maybe not great. Patrick Mahomes has played very good so far, about 2,500 yards and 17 touchdowns, though he has had some bad games. He still is my pick for MVP.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm going to go with the other guy. Obviously, this is what it came down to last year with Hurts and Mahomes. I just think the Eagles look like the better team right now. And I know it's not a team award, but when we get down the stretch of the season, I trust the Eagles to probably end the year with a better record than the Chiefs. Obviously, very close. Two of the best teams in football, the best on each side. But you could say his stats are buffed with the tush push with the QB sneaks, but at the end of the day, those do go on his stat sheet and they help with 22 total touchdowns, only 8 picks. His team is 9-1, and he's looked incredible every game except for that game against the Jets that he looked pretty bad in. But besides that, I've been seeing, all great things. And I'm sure both you and I are anticipating this Monday night matchup where they go head to head. Gonna see maybe not one prove that they're better than the other. Obviously, I think we know Mahomes is the better guy, but who's gonna make their resume builder this season? And a head to head matchup is absolutely gonna help.
Yeah, and kind of going away from the NFL now, starting to go over to the NBA, we can talk about a team that hasn't been great recently, the Clippers with James Harden. And as we've seen these past few games, James Harden has not looked very good. There's been some games like last game, he dropped 21 points. They haven't won a game though with him. So looking at this team, a little bit of thoughts going around. What do you think is going wrong with this Clippers team? Do you think James Harden should be benched?
I don't, but I have a lot to say about this. I'm sure you do too. So I'm going to say my piece here, and then I'm really interested to see what you have to say about this. Obviously, 76ers fans, if you guys don't know, he is not me. But anyways, Harden has shown versatility through his career. I know people say he's a ball hog, but he has played many different roles throughout his, 13, 14-year career. I guess my point is he started off as a six man in OKC. He was great in that role. And then he had the scoring emphasis on him in Houston. Obviously, he won an MVP. He was the go-to option, the only option for that Rockets team. Then he went to Philadelphia. And although he ended his career pretty rough there, he was successful as a pass first point guard. Obviously, he got his buckets, but he led the league in assists. So he has shown that he can come off the bench. He's shown that he can be the star of the NBA, and he's shown that he can be an assist machine, right? And we're getting to a point where when he was in Houston, his usage rating was at 40. For anybody that doesn't know advanced stats, that is ridiculous. Right now, it is all the way down at 19. Even in Philly, he was at 27. The point is, Harden does not have the ball as much as he has any other time in his entire career. In order for Harden to elevate his game, he has to show that versatility that he's shown through the rest of his career, and he has to do something completely new, Banning. I'm not going to lie to you. He has to start shooting spot up threes. James Harden loves his step back. It's his signature move, and he will not shoot a spot up three. He hates doing it, and he's inefficient in those looks comparatively to how good he is from shooting in most places on the court. He has to be comfortable doing that because if he's going to share the court with Westbrook, Kawhi, and PG, guys who have the ball in their hands, and guys who are comfortable putting the ball on the floor and making the right pass, it's going to leave James Harden with some open looks. He cannot be dribbling. He has to be comfortable being a spot up shooter. And I know that's tough for a guy that was a former MVP to be a spot up shooter. I think he should still show off his versatility in other ways, be comfortable with the ball himself, but he has to be willing to take the open threes when he gets them. Or the other option is he goes back to that Philly ways where he was the prime playmaker at the point guard position. And then the Clippers have to make a decision to bench Russell Westbrook. Because if we both know Harden is a better player than Westbrook right now, if there is going to be one ball dominant guard, it has to be Harden. And he has to be willing to not just put up shots. He has to go back to those Philadelphia days, treat Kawhi and treat PG like they're guys like Tobias Harris and Joel Embiid. I know there's a skill gap there, but he succeeded with those guys. He needs to be willing to either be an elite playmaker like he's shown he can be, or he has to be willing to shoot spot up threes. The way he's playing right now, this Clippers team is never going to work. But if we're talking about the skill level that Harden has, I'm confident he can do both of those things. It's just when is he going to buy in and do it, or when is Ty Lue going to make a decision to put Westbrook on the bench? Those are the two options for me.
Yeah, and I think my opinion clearly aligns here. If you guys, I'm sure you have seen the NBA rant from Brian Damaris the other day on Bally Sports about James Harden. And just kind of summing it up, James Harden, he basically said he's one of those guys where he said over and over, he has bad roommates, everyone else is bad, but he's never really sat down and thought maybe he's the bad guy in the situation. throughout his whole entire career, James Harden has been fed whatever he wants. Mike D'Antoni, they brought him in. They brought in Dwight Howard when they got sick of him. They got rid of him. When they wanted Chris Paul, they brought him in. And then he decided to leave to go to Brooklyn. That situation didn't work out. He went to Philly and he went back there with his former GM. And then he got upset that his GM promised him a max contract that he'd pay him back later when he took the pay cut. And the reason he didn't give him that money is no one thought that he deserved that money in the end. He said he was going to give him that money when James Harden was playing well, when he was putting up 20 points per game, 12 assists per game for the Sixers. And especially these past few days from what we've seen Doc Rivers even talk about it. James Harden was very affected by not making the All-Star game last year, and we saw that too. After the All-Star game, when he wasn't announced an All-Star, he started to shoot more. He stopped being that assist player that he was before because he felt personally attacked that people in the NBA didn't think that he was one of the best players anymore because he wasn't shooting enough. And then we saw what happened in the playoffs where he couldn't make a shot for some games. There obviously was some games where he could play fantastic, but it seemed like in the end, obviously it was all overshadowed by him not playing well. James Harden has been the problem the past few years. He's not the same player that he was before. If he wanted to be in the system like Philadelphia last year, where he was a primary ball passer, he went out there, got 12 assists a game, but still scored 20 points, playing with an MVP. I don't know what else you can ask for. You're playing with arguably the best player in the league last year who won the MVP award. Now you're leaving another situation. So what else can you do if you're James Harden except figure out that maybe you are the problem?
Yeah, and I knew emotions would fly high there. And the Clippers, obviously one of the most disappointing teams, and pretty surprised there. But there's some other surprises in the West doing quite well. So, I mean, with that being said, you look at the Western Conference standings, and you find teams like the Rockets and the Timberwolves hanging around the top. What do you make of these teams? Are either of them legit? And what do you chalk up their success to?
Well, I think just going back to the Clippers, like we were just talking about, I know
there's
it just seems like
there's no segue.
the past few years, I know a lot of people have been complaining about Russell Westbrook. Obviously, Russell Westbrook has come out and kind of done these same things. But now with Russell Westbrook and James Harden on the same team, we see Russell Westbrook fill his role. He knows that he's not as good as he used to be. And now James Harden is coming in. And I've seen a lot of Clippers fans say they don't even want James Harden. So it seems like the curse the past few years where trading for James Harden, you're very excited that you won the trade. I know last year the Sixers, I was very excited about it for a while until the playoffs. The Clippers are already over the James Harden trade. They already want him out again. They're already making mock trades to trade him at the trade deadline, which is interesting to look at. I think they're a better team without James Harden.
I want to keep our Clippers fans here, so I guess I'll jump back in this argument too. I do think the Clippers have a lot of problems. I don't think James Harden was the best fit. Comparatively, if they could have got a guy like Zach LaVine, I think that would have made the team a lot better, even though most people would say Harden is the better player, right? I don't think he's the perfect fit, but just because Westbrook is not playing like a superstar anymore, he's accepted his role, does not mean Westbrook is necessarily a good player for this team either. Let's not forget, Westbrook is still one of the most inefficient shooters in the league, and I love that there's great NBA duos, right? I know that team has 4 guys. It's really 3. Let's not pretend like Westbrook's an all-star, right? But Paul George and Kawhi is a pretty good duo, right? Do not get me wrong. But when we talk about elite shooting duos, they are not 2 of the most efficient shooters in the NBA, right? They are long past that point. They are guys that go through stretches where they kind of shot chuck too. I like Kawhi. He's an elite defender, but when he's on the court, ever since Toronto, it's not like he is the most efficient player, right? He's going to put up a lot of shots, and, he's going to go through stretches where he makes 20 in a row, but he's also going to go through stretches where he can't hit the rim, right? He's not an elite shooter or anything like that. Paul George, a little bit better, but he has his moments as well. Playoff P comes to mind. Westbrook is not a great fit for this team either. So with James Harden, I get the idea. You get kind of an improved version of Westbrook hypothetically. So what are you going to do when you have to put both of them on the court together? And what do you do when that's your starting backcourt? There's a lot of problems with this Clippers team that I think is chalked up more to the team building and more chalked up to Ty Lue than it is to any player that's really playing on it. I mean, don't get me wrong. I've come on here and said I think Ty Lue is a pretty good coach. I agree with that statement still. But we see last night when they take on Denver, and they're going against the best player in the NBA, Nikola Jokic, and they have Ivica Zubac, who is not the best defender or anything, but comparably for size and length, he matches up well on Jokic. They're up by 8, and they pull him out of the game to put guys like Russell Westbrook in and play small ball. It is ridiculous, and it doesn't work like that. With the Clippers, I understand fans being mad because the whole process is messed up, but you can't complain about your team every week. You have to build a squad based on the players that you have on the team, and that is up to Ty Lue at this point. I think he can do it. I honestly think the best case scenario is that happens when you move Westbrook to the bench, but what do you do? Like, is that what's going to happen? If it is, I think this Clippers team can contend, but there's a reason we're both talking so negatively about them. I don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah, I think this team, I'm going to give a comparison. This team reminds me of the Nets when they traded for KG and Paul Pierce. This is a bad retirement home of 4 washed up players at this point. I like all of these guys, but Kawhi Leonard can't stay healthy. Paul George has games where he's good and then he can't play either. Russell Westbrook is not very good anymore. James Harden he doesn't even play in the NBA for half of the games. He's in Vegas for half of the weeks. He's given everything that he's wanted and hasn't done anything with it since he was on the Rockets. So this team is bad, and I'm not a Clippers fan. I had high expectations for this team. They went out, and I don't think there's any way to salvage this season after the James Harden trade. I don't really know what you can do for the rest of the year, but pretty much everyone's going to be gone with contracts. So I think you have to play out this season. You can still maybe get into the playoffs at this point. I know the season has started and it hasn't looked good. It statistically, they're never going to win a game with James Harden as of right now, since they haven't yet. So they could just end up going 3-79 to this point, and I wouldn't be surprised. But we'll see what happens with this team. Very disappointing through the first 10 games. Hopefully by the end of the season, we see something change, because right now, if you're a Clippers fan, I would not be very happy. But like you said before, moving over to another team like the Rockets, who they're going to play in 2 days now. They're going to play Friday in the play-in tournament. When I'm looking at these two teams too, I'd rather have Dillon Brooks than James Harden at this point.
I don't leave me a lot of room to work there. I think for this Rockets team, having a guy like Dillon Brooks is incredible. I will say that. And that is something. I know he was horrible in the playoffs, not very well liked by anyone, but he fills a role that they've been dying to fill in the last couple of seasons. The Rockets, similar to a team like Oklahoma City, loves to draft prospect wings that are incredibly athletic, and we don't really know what we're going to get from them. Instead, they just get an actual small forward with Dillon Brooks, who plays hard-nosed defense, and although a streaky shooter, when he's hot, is one of the better ones in the entire league. That fits in really well for a guy like Jalen Green, who loves to have the ball in his hands, and it fits even better for the actual superstar of this team, Alperen Sengun, because he is baby Jokic. I know that's crazy to say. I don't think he'll ever reach the heights that Jokic reaches, being a multi-time MVP, but they play the game of basketball so similarly, considering they are both elite passers and they're comfortable with the ball in their hands. When you have a guy like Dillon Brooks, who's comfortable shooting threes, is good at shooting threes, especially in the regular season, it allows Sengun's game to completely open up. And my question with this Rockets team is not if they're good, because right now they are good. Ime Udoka has made this team that was formerly a bunch of young guys. He brought in some vets, and they look confident and they look like a good team in the NBA. I don't know if it's going to last, but right now, absolutely. My question is Jalen Green. Is he going to step up? Is he ever going to shoot more than 40% from the field in his career? Because if he plays like this, the Rockets are better off not re-signing him. And I know that's crazy to say, because Jalen Green is a good player, but when you have an inefficient shot chucker next to an incredibly built offense, that it absolutely ruins the momentum. And that's the only Rockets downfall. Jalen Green is a good player, but when the ball sinks into his hands and he gets black hole tunnel vision and doesn't want to pass to his teammates, it absolutely shores up. And I'll give you another Harden bit right here. That's kind of like what Harden's doing in Los Angeles, and you saw how hard we are on him. I don't want Jalen Green to develop into the next James Harden. He needs to be comfortable as a playmaker. He doesn't need to be elite, but you need to be a shooting guard that shoots more than 40% from the field if you're going to be an all-star like we expect him to be.
Yeah, so talking about this team too, you said it kind of drags them down with an inefficient shot chucker. Reminds me a lot of the Hawks situation that they're in right now with Trae Young. I think Trae Young, a little bit better, more developed than Jalen Green to this point. But you can look at that and say that that may be the reason why the Hawks aren't this top end team that we've seen. They have a lot of good talent. I think this Rockets team, like you said, Alperen Sengun has been fantastic. I mean, this is a guy that isn't a shot first guy. He's going to go out there and try to get passes and assist. He's kind of in this same area, like you said, with Jokic, like a guy like Josh Giddey. A lot of these players kind of getting those assists first and then going out and scoring, still putting up 20 points per game. I don't think this team necessarily is a contender. They have been really good so far. I do think they're kind of missing a superstar guy. I do think one of these players could develop into a star, maybe Sengun. Jalen Green, I know, has the potential to, but I don't really know exactly what we'd see from a guy like him. But as of right now, they don't have that player. So they have been good with guys like Van Vliet. Dylan Brooks have been good, but I don't really expect Van Vliet and Dylan Brooks to be these all NBA, all star like guys all season. And I still think they are waiting on guys to develop too, like Amen Thompson. It hasn't been that long, too. I mean, like I said before in the season, if you guys saw that video, Asor Thompson was going to come out and be a better player from day one just because he was going to start and get more looks. So I do think some people pointing at Amen Thompson maybe not developing as much. He just hasn't had the opportunity yet. I do think he will towards the end of the season. I don't think this team is necessarily a contender right now, but there is a lot of good things going on right now. Ime Udoka is a fantastic coach, like we've seen before with the Celtics. So him going out there, hopefully they fully invest in a guy like Sengun and make sure that he is the best player on this team, because I think he is the best player on this team. Even a guy like Jabari Smith can go out there and still has a lot of room to develop too. So I do think they'll probably move in and out of guys throughout these next few years. I know Van Vliet, Dylan Brooks signed for a while, but I don't necessarily see those guys being cornerstones on this team. And I wouldn't be surprised if Sengun starts to develop too. I do think the Rockets are a sneaky contender to maybe even get a guy like Zach LaVine at the trade deadline.
Yeah, and I love that you brought up Jabari Smith. That was going to be my only other additional point right there, because they invested a high draft pick into him, and because he started off his career so slow, I think people are a little cooled off on him. But let's not forget what we saw at Auburn, what we've seen in flashes in the NBA. I mean, this could be a perennial like all-star level front court if him and Alperen Sengun develop well. And at that point, with the NBA, we've seen shockingly take kind of a direction where the big man is supreme once again. I mean, that's really what you want. They build a backcourt around that. Whether it is Jalen Green buying in more and being a better player, that would be best case scenario. But if you get Jabari Smith and Alperen Sengun to be all-star level players, then you have Ime Udoka already, who develops big men pretty well based on what I've seen. I would be very happy with that if I was a Houston fan.
Yeah, and moving on to another team in this same area, the Timberwolves, who are playing very well, 8-2 through their first 10 games. And this team, I don't really necessarily think is a contender. I think this is the best team they've had in a while. Anthony Edwards is looking very good. But when we look at it, Karl Anthony Towns, Rudy Gobert, Naz Reid too, all of these guys have been playing well. But outside of that, I do think there's going to be issues coming off of the bench. A lot of three of their four best players, highest scoring players, are all big men, which can be an issue, especially when they're going up against other teams in the playoffs. They have looked good, but I don't think this team really is a contender. But Anthony Edwards is taking that leap that we all expected him to this year.
Yeah, and I'm going to be short and sweet with this because I could push Naz Reid propaganda all day. I'm a huge fan of his. I think he's an incredible player, and I think he should start in the NBA. I know you have Karl Anthony Towns. I know he's been your face of the franchise. I know you drafted him early. I know he has a lot of value. I know he has jersey sales. You need to trade Karl Anthony Towns. I don't care how good you are. I really like him. I don't necessarily think he's a bad player. I still think he shows flashes of being one of the best big men in basketball. Don't get me wrong. I think Naz Reid is younger, and I would invest more into him. And the value you can get from a guy like Cat right now is the best it's going to be since, he was a rookie, since he was a young guy, right? This is the most value you're going to get for him. You can't hold on to him. And with a guy like Naz Reid, if I'm being honest, if I was a Timberwolves fan, I would be much more scared of losing him than losing Cat, just because you can get value from Karl Anthony Towns. I know that's disappointing for Timberwolves fans, especially starting so strong, especially with Anthony Edwards looking like one of the best guards in the NBA. But I still think the team is in need of a roster reboot. And if that is trading Karl Anthony Towns and getting a lot of draft picks or maybe some guys that can contribute off the bench, I think that's the best case scenario for Minnesota. And hopefully you can still hold on to Anthony Edwards if you do that.
Yeah, and ending off this episode, we'll go through our rookie recap of the week. And so far, we have seen great games from Victor and Chet Holmgren, but some other guys that I do want to point out too. My guy who I was talking about before this season, hyping him up, Brandon Podziemski, a great performance the other night, 23 points, 7 rebounds, and 5 assists. I'm sure you guys have probably seen the other picture going around too, 8 points in a minute. Very efficient game there too. He has been exactly what I expected this team to do. And I know Steve Kerr kind of is hesitant to play younger players, especially rookies. I know he's been able to get guys developed like Jordan Poole, but Brandon Podziemski got the co-sign by Steph Curry, which obviously means a lot. Steph Curry, one of the best players ever. And Brandon Podziemski has played fantastic. Another guy too who has emerged within the past few games specifically is Jordan Hawkins. He's now third in rookie points per game. He's played fantastic for the Pelicans. He's had some very big games the past few games. He's had a 31-point performance and a 25-point performance too. Other guys who have played good too. Hami Hackes for Miami has played good. Marcus Sasser, too, for Detroit. Both of these guys have been good. A lot of other guys, too. Asur Thompson has been good offensively and defensively.
Yeah, and you covered a lot of the bases there. Jordan Hawkins needs to get that 3-point percentage up, field goal percentage up, but with a rookie, you expect them to, kind of just have to put up a lot of shots. And it's encouraging that the Pelicans, who are in a tough spot right now, are bought into giving Jordan Hawkins those looks, because coming out of UConn, he was a guy I expected to be able to develop really well. Put him in the same tier as a guy like Jet Howard, and Jet Howard is kind of stuck on a bench with a lot of guards in Orlando, but a guy like Jordan Hawkins, not a lot of guys in front of him in that Pelicans backcourt. He looks great. Asar Thompson, obviously, we know he's been awesome. And then Victor and Chet at the top. I think Victor's pulling away a little bit as the rookie of the year favorite. I do think he's a better player, which is, not ridiculous to say. Some people will tell you he's the best player in the NBA already. I'm not going out on a limb when I say I think he's a little bit better than Chet, but those two have just looked incredible all season. And although I do think Victor is better, I want to give Chet some credit. He's more the third or fourth option on his team, and they're putting up somewhat comparable stats. So both of the big guys impressed me quite a bit. Happy that we haven't seen a whole lot of injuries yet. Obviously, fingers tied, but we want these young guys to develop. And just one last thing. I mean, with Scoot Henderson, obviously averaging 4 turnovers a night, not looking great, looking like the second best rookie on the Blazers right now, with Tumani Kamara having an unprecedented good season. It's really tough, but I'm just telling you guys at home, do not hop off the Scoot Henderson train yet. He's going to have a tough season. Obviously, it's disappointing because it seems like he's been preparing for the NBA ever since high school, obviously with the G League route. Don't jump off him yet. He's still shown flashes why he's incredible, especially as an athlete. So hoping for the best for him. I think when we talk about the rookie recap in upcoming weeks, we should expect Scoot Henderson's numbers to look a little bit better, but it is important to point out how rough he's looked so far, being a highly touted prospect.
Yeah, and I'm gonna give you guys one player to look out for when we come back next week. Bilal Coulibaly for you for Washington has played very well. He's had about 35 minutes per game throughout these past few games. There's a lot of struggles going on with guys like Jordan Poole over there. So a guy to watch out for when we come back next week.
Yeah, I think that's a great take. I think Bilal is going to have a really solid season, and I'm happy that they decided not to put him in the G League. There was rumors of that earlier. He needs NBA minutes, and as you mentioned, I think he's going to succeed when he gets them.
Yeah, and we will see you guys next week with more NBA and NFL talk.
See you guys.